There are lots of ways to collect data, and the list you see on your screen is by no means a comprehensive list. But they are some of the most common approaches, and I want to take a bit of time to walk through some of them so you have an idea of the sources behind some of the data you may encounter. Let's start with one that is actually very, very rare in social research, and that's experiments. But I start here because they're often considered the standard in canonical and especially natural sciences, and so we're going to use this as our base of reference. But let me just note here that when most people say, I conducted an experiment, they are horribly misusing the term. Experiments are a very, very specific kind of methodological inquiry. They allow us to directly probe causal relationships by comparing two or more groups to each other that differ by only one controllable factor. In short, experiments have to have a control group. We have to be able to isolate the impact of one particular variable by taking action on that variable and observing the consequences. And this is incredibly rare in social scientific research, in part because of just the sheer challenge of doing that when people are involved, and also because often there are some significant ethical implications when people are involved. So we don't usually do experiments. One we do a lot, and that you have probably participated in at some point in your life, is a survey. Surveys are a way of asking a fixed set of questions of a given group of people. Done properly, they are an incredibly useful way of gathering a large volume of data relatively quickly. They can be either quantitative or qualitative, although they do tend to lend themselves to more quantified approaches. They are especially good for deductive research on phenomena that are fairly familiar to us and for which we know the contours of the key variables of interest, but we want to explore some relationship between those variables. They can be done on paper, over the phone, on the internet. The mechanism really doesn't matter as much as the sampling strategy. The challenge is we can't clarify a misunderstood question, so we have to be very careful to define it correctly in advance. Another very common technique is an interview. Interviews are a way of asking more open-ended questions of some group of people. They can also be both quantitative or qualitative, although they do tend to lend themselves to the more qualitative side of research. A good way to think about this in contrast to surveys is that surveys allow us to go wide, but interviews allow us to go deep. Interviews are especially good for inductive research or for outlining the contours of a poorly understood social phenomenon. One advantage of interviews is that we can clarify questions or follow up on things of interest very easily in the moment. One significant challenge is that they tend to be very time-consuming, and we often cannot get as large of a sample as we might with surveys. So they're both very useful, but there's a bit of a trade-off involved in either one. One alternative form of an interview that's worth mentioning is what's called a focus group. Essentially, a focus group is an interview conducted with multiple people simultaneously. This is very common in marketing and community-driven research. Another area that you may hear about occasionally, although we won't spend much time on this course beyond the minute or so we're giving right now, is called ethnography, sometimes also called field research or participant observation. It goes under a lot of different names. What we're basically talking about is a way of directly observing social interactions in what we might call their natural habitat. It is almost always qualitative in its approach. Ethnography allows us to tap into situations that we may know very little about in advance, or may even have difficulty reaching via interviews or surveys. And it's an especially useful technique for uncovering meaning and micro-mechanisms in the social world. The biggest challenge behind ethnographies is that, well, partly it's figuring out what's even worthy of documenting and what's not, because we're kind of recording everything, but also they can be incredibly time-consuming. But done well, They can tell us some amazing, amazing material about the social world. Unobtrusive methods allow us to explore the social world without actually being social. When we say unobtrusive, what we mean is there is no way we can influence the social process in question. And there are a lot of things that fall under this broad category. I'm only going to look at two of them, but I will say that these approaches can be either qualitative or quantitative, or sometimes even both. And I've seen a variety of different approaches that follow this that span both directions. A very common example of this is what we might call archival data, or sometimes content analysis. Technically, they refer to different things, but they're so similar, we'll treat them in the same breath. When we say archival data, we are talking about any physical or virtual object made by people. And this can include everything from commodities, to journals and diaries, to medical records, to newspapers and magazines, to websites, to TV shows, to pictures, to movies, to tweets, to TikTok reels, to YouTube videos. Hopefully you get the idea at this point. Often this involves developing codes for understanding the artifacts. I'll give you a very simple example of one. When I would teach Introduction to Sociology, one of the assignments I would give my students is what I call the Children's Toys assignment. And in this assignment, I would send them to a store, typically a department store or a toy store, something that had a reasonable toy selection. And I would have them go down two particular aisles. First, I wanted them to find the aisle with the Barbies. And then I wanted them to find an aisle with the action figures. And if you're paying attention, you can probably hear some of the difference. One of the things I wanted them to look for was how toys both reflect and reproduce various things around gender and the way that we gender our toys for children. We would also be looking at things like how they represent and reflect class, race, and a few other features as well. But what we're doing is we're not having to interact with people, but we're going into where toys are in their, we might say, their natural habitat, and we're looking at the various themes that we might identify just from these objects that someone has created. Now, another example of an unobtrusive measure, and one that we are going to be particularly focusing on this semester, is what we might call secondary data analysis. Essentially, this is when we use data that someone else has gathered and we perform our own analysis on those data. This is most commonly done with very large, typically quantitative data sets, as the effort of gathering so much data is just enormous. So, since we're going to spend a little bit more time on this, let me start by just throwing out a question of, well, where might you find such data sources? There are lots of places you can look, and as you develop your topics, I will leave it to you to do a bit of searching on your own, and please feel free to use your internet sleuthing skills to find some stuff. But if you're looking for some ideas of where to start, you might look at government agencies, census.gov, data.gov, and many others, and don't forget state governments. Typically, you're going to find all sorts of publicly funded data sets that, because they were funded by taxpayer money, they're freely available. You might also look to various nonprofit think tanks. Some particularly good ones would include the General Social Survey, or, if you don't mind doing a little digging, Pew Research. And there are plenty of other public opinion think tanks and nonprofits that are out there, but be careful about those that may have a particular agenda or political bias. That doesn't necessarily mean that they're wrong, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're a bad source. It just means you might need to apply a little extra scrutiny to their data. And then you can also look at kaggle.com/datasets. They have an entire section on social sciences data, and there's plenty there that you may find that might even spark a research question for you. There are lots of other examples of unobtrusive data, but let's not get too lost in the weeds. The final one I want to think about is social network analysis. While all the other methods described focus on some set of attributes or a set of entities, the crux of social network analysis is a focus on relationship between those entities. It is a way of understanding interdependence among social actors by focusing on patterns of relationship and connections between entities. There are lots of different kinds of relationships we could think about. We could think about those between individuals, such as friendship ties, dating, marriage and family relationships, which is the example you see on the screen, sex, email exchanges. We could also think about relationships between organizations, such as trade, corporate ownership, firm interlock. The example you see that just appeared is actually relationships between locally oriented food outlets in southern New England, and we'll be playing with that data set a little bit later on when we get to the network analysis unit. We could also think about relationships between nation states, such as trade, diplomatic ties, war. The sky is really the limit, and we'll talk more about this in a few weeks when we get to that particular